The title of my talk today is on forwards, as Kathy has highlighted, and I come to you, in a sense, in the middle of a piece of research which has been inspired by work I was doing for the last 10 years on locating place names in one of the great Irish epic stories, Táin Bó Cúailnge. The word ford is a very common label to anybody living in Ireland today, whether they speak English or Irish. Ford, Farset and Scariff are names that will be familiar to many people. It's probably good to begin with a dictionary definition, and that, supplied by the Merriam-Webster dictionary, gives us this phrase: a shallow part of a body of water that may be crossed by wading. In Irish, as I flagged at in the header, there are three words used to denote fords, the most common of which is this is translated by most dictionaries as ford, but the Dictionary of the Irish Language gives us a number of different conceptual or figurative meanings for it, including one, an open space or hollow between two objects, and we shall return to that in a moment. The term farset can mean a number of different things, principally applied, I think, in many cases to sandbanks. And the place we know as Belfast, originally Belfast, probably is using farset in that sense. However, as Deneen and the Dictionary of the Irish Language point out, it also is pointing out that it is used to describe fords, particularly fords in many cases in tidal locations. And Scariff, which gives rise, of course, to places like Scariff in County Clare, is again a name that is sometimes applied to places where shallow water occurs. But in the sense of its use in relation to fording points, it seems to describe fords which perhaps where perhaps the ford bed is rough and stony. Defining fords is a difficult subject because they vary considerably in their, I suppose, in their morphology. The common element is this idea of traffic making a passage through water. And by traffic, I mean people, animals, and vehicles, perhaps all three, in many cases, perhaps not vehicles, just people and animals. And also water, in the sense that the classic ford is a river, something bridging a river, as it were, or a stream. But tidal inlets are definitely need to be included in this definition. Dundalk Bay, where I grew up, is a vast tidal inlet, very shallow, and there is a ford across it from effectively Blackrock into the Cooley Peninsula, which is 6.5 kilometres in length. And historically, and in local memory, it was a place that could be walked across at low tide. And there are similar tidal bays and tidal fords in the region surrounding Sligo. Fords I describe as gifts of nature, and this is a phrase that has caused a few eyebrows to be raised. How are they archaeological if they're gifts of nature? Well, they're exploited by human communities, but they're given to us by nature, in the same way as a mountain pass is negotiated and perhaps developed into a routeway, but has been created by natural processes. And it's important to recognize that it's the presence of a reef, i.e. rock coming close to the surface and intruding into the bed of a river, a shoal which is built up perhaps over time in the bed of a river because of depositional patterns, small islands which offer some dry land in the passage across the river, or, as I've outlined earlier, tidal patterns that allow this fording to take place, as it were. So I suspect that human agency is very rarely, if ever, involved in the creation of fords, but I do allow that fords may have been maintained. They are unmonumental. In other words, they're distinctly lacking in many cases in any surface expression. But there's no doubt that once a ford is identified as a suitable crossing place, it may well have been sustained through enhancement over time, because gradual changes to a river course, silting or erosion, would necessitate investment in the ford. And because routeways came to and ran from the ford, there was a certain, as it were, imperative on communities and perhaps leaders in those communities to maintain the crossing point. That may have been the case at one of the more famous crossing points on the River Shannon at Lanesborough, Ballyleague. Ballyleague itself, of course, giving us the name Baile Aha League, the mouth of the ford of the flags, as it were. And in the Annals of the Four Masters for the year 1000, there is this well-known reference to Tuchar Ah Liach de Yenav le Muel Shochlin Guji Lach Nahawan. The causeway of Ahleague was made by Muel Shochlin to the middle of the river. The commentaries on the Annals tell us that this seems to have been a cooperative project between Will Shocklin, who was High King of Ireland at the time, and the High King of Connacht, hence the carrying of the causeway to the middle of the river. Now, what's interesting here is the use of the word tuchar, not not farsid or scarab. And as, of course, as Cassie has explained, tuchar has a very specific meaning in Irish archaeology. And also is a very well-used term in place names, as she has outlined. I think tuchar here is referring to a submerged causeway. They are lining the bed of the ford with flags in order to possibly improve the frequency by which people can cross the Shannon. And therefore, it's an interesting use of the term. But it does highlight the fact that fords, once established, they are invested in, they are maintained. And this may have been a much more common practice than we are perhaps see in these very exceptional references to this ford at Ballyahaliach. Now, in terms of looking at the use of fords, I think the term pinch point is apposite because it's sometimes used by those who are involved in traffic control and maintenance. Terrain compels traffic to converge and to tarry at the ford. I've used the term short periods here, but one can think of a multitude of short periods which are precipitated by simply waiting for somebody to cross the ford so that then you can cross in the opposite direction, right up to people being delayed at fords for perhaps days or longer periods because of spates in the river itself. And one can also envisage that settlement might congregate around these places, if only for the provision of services to those who are so delayed, but also perhaps to control these crossing points. Fords are also often described as liminal, particularly those that are referenced in early medieval literature. It's often the case that where a warrior is attracted to a ford, he or she is stepping outside the normal rules of society and is perhaps setting themselves up for a confrontation with somebody else. We know from numerous references in the annals that fords are used as parleying places. They're places where battles take place, and particularly in the narrative literature, they're places where single combats occur. One thinks of the great 3-day single combat between Cuchulainn and Ferdia at the ford of Ardee in County Louth. They involve movement from one space to another, from one side to another. But this movement is more, it seems, in many cases, than simply just a transit from A to B. If we go back to the Dictionary of the Irish Language, the range of meanings given therein for the word in its medieval sense include, as I've said, an open space or hollow between two objects, but also the phrase finds a way to overcome or finds a means of achieving, which infers that the ford itself is some kind of an obstacle and that there is a sense of having completed a task involved. And certainly in medieval Irish, I get the sense that ford is used in a figurative sense. The old phrase holding the fort is applied in early Irish to holding the ford, And one gets some sense here that it could be used in a figurative sense as well as a physical sense. The key element in all of this, of course, is water. And water, particularly water which is in the form of a river, often becomes a boundary between regions, a boundary perhaps between territories. And the ford, in crossing that boundary, is breaching it, and therefore takes on a certain significance, which is interesting to explore. So to begin that exploration, I'm going to go now to a series of full screen slides. And this is perhaps a good place to start. Meelick in southeast Galway is a site which jumps out at you, a location that jumps out at you because of the sheer number of archaeological locations which have been mapped by the Archaeological Survey of Ireland. I'm here showing it from the Heritage Maps website, where I can combine the Archaeological Monumental Associations with find spots from the National Museum of Ireland database. These are the two green dots, one of them to the immediate right of the Cay of Meelick, rather small, the other at Keelogue, rather large. And quite a body of material has been recovered from the ford at Keelogue. But I introduced this slide simply to you on the basis that without invoking the ford, in other words, without thinking about the elephant in the room, as it were, these sites do not make much sense. Why are so much archaeology, particularly Napoleonic and medieval archaeology, clustering around the banks of the River Shannon at this particular point? And as you can see from the black line running down the centre of the river, this is the join point, or the convergence point, of three counties. So it's a most interesting location. And without bringing the ford to bear on it, it forms a kind of a puzzle. But when you introduce the ford into the equation, you begin to see that much of this archaeology may be related to its presence. A similar situation pertains in relation to what is now a very famous site excavated by Tracy Collins and colleagues in the early 2000s at Hermitage on the lower reaches of the Shannon, just above Limerick. And the red dots here indicate the locations where she and her team uncovered a range of material, including 4 Mesolithic burials, one of which has been dated to, I think, over 7,000 BC, and another 2 in the following millennium. Very early on in her research on this site, Tracy and her colleagues identified the fact that this was no mere, as it were, coincidence that these finds were found on the river right beside the famous As Dannan, the fall of Dannan, because it is recognised that there is a fording point here on the Shannon. And this fording point is referred to not by the name or Farsid or Scariv, but it is referred to as As Dannan. And in bardic poetry of the early 17th century, the phrase Har As Dannan occurs. So the crossing, it is a crossing point, even though it doesn't bear a ford name. It is also a point on the Shannon which is marking a county boundary, and therefore also marking the boundaries of baronies and parishes. And it was dominated in medieval times by Dunas Castle, which is shown intact on the Down Survey map of the 1560s. So again, an interesting location where the presence of the ford adds not only just interest to the archaeological finds, but may well explain why these finds are clustering in this particular area. Now, to jump forward in time to the place where I now reside, Clarenbridge in County Galway, this is a famous old photograph of the Clarenbridge Oyster Festival, founded by the equally famous Paddy Burke, whose name is celebrated on the gable of his steak and fish house, as it were, on the north bank of the River Clarine, from which Clarenbridge takes its name. The bridge is late 18th century in date, but right beside it, on the downstream side, you can see the old ford which crossed here. Now, Clarenbridge is an estate village. It developed relatively recently as a picturesque village outside the gates of the Reddington estate at Kilcornan. And what's interesting about the layout of the village is that the houses, which you can see in the background, align onto the ford, not onto the bridge. And a similar situation pertains at the south side of the river from where we are viewing the ford. So quite clearly, these houses were built or exist on a street line which was orientated onto the ford, and the bridge is a more recent addition to this landscape. Now, I introduced this slide to correct what seems to me a fundamental error about whatever writing is taking place on fords to date. That is, that statements such as that made in the Historical Dictionary of the Gaelic Place Names in the first volume of this very, very valuable and growing repository of information about all Irish place names. It's been conducted by linguists in the Ryan na Gaeilge in the University College in Cork under the title of the Locus Project, led by Pádraig Ó Riain and others. But they reproduce a statement which is common in 19th and 20th century literature, that ancient roadways remain unaltered with bridges replacing the fords at river crossings. This is generally not the case. It can occur as at Clarenbridge, but I want to examine three fords where we shall see that this is exceptional rather than normal. The first of these is in the northern part of County Louth at a place called Toborona, which, if you know Dundalk, is on the northern outskirts of it. Here we have a very picturesque scene, given that we're so close to the town, where we have a weir on the Castletown River, and just above it there is an old fording spot, clearly indicated by the convergence of old laneways on the Ordnance Survey maps. But in the background, you can't really make it out in the photograph, so I bring it up into focus. There is a two-arched bridge which appears to have been built sometime in the last years of the 18th century. It's not marked on the Taylor and Skinner map of Louth of 1778, but is there by the time of the Ordnance Survey. If we go and look at this on the first edition of the Ordnance Survey maps, we can see dead centre the cutwaters of the bridge. And then downstream to the right of it, we see the weir that we saw in the previous photograph. And then if we roll out a little highlighter, we can see the line of the ford crossing the river just above the weir. And you can see that this old ford is preserved in laneways descending to the fording point from north and south. Two other locations are important here. One, the proximity of a well dedicated to St. John, hence Toborona, Toborone, or John's Well, giving name to the locality. But the second location is one I only became aware of very, very recently, when the TII published a very fine book on the excavations on the western bypass section of the M1 motorway. This is a site in Balregan, which is on a peninsula which is created by the confluence of the Castletown River with the Kilcurry River. And these have just been highlighted at top left. Now, before we look at that in more detail, if we also look at the 25-inch Ordnance Survey map, we get an additional piece of information, as well as highlighting just the routeway there. We come up with this, that the highest point to which the ordinary tides flow comes to within 50 meters of the ford. So the ford is just above the high water limit, but it's just below a confluence of two rivers. Now, using one of the very fine aerials in Shane Delaney's and other authors' book Around the Bay of Dundalk, as I mentioned, I want to just roll out a sequence of highlights here. The convergence of the two rivers, the meandering of the Castletown down below the fording point, which now comes into view, indicates that the river below that point is not only tidal, and we let the tidal flow come up, it is very marshy and would inhibit any regular crossing. So you can see that the ford is situated between two tight places, as it were, and the routeway that it serves can only have crossed at that particular point between the two, conveniently crossed. Further upstream, the river trifurcates and further divides, so that anybody trying to traverse north to south or vice versa would have had difficulty upstream from Toborona. But when you add in the conventional archaeology to this, things get much more interesting. For John's Well is not only just an isolated holy well, it is the site of a midsummer pattern that was suppressed by the clergy in the early 19th century. And the excavations as part of the M1 motorway revealed an embanked enclosure with a big collection of grooved ware dated to approximately 2800 to 2400 BCE. And this wasn't the earliest phase of activity in the site, because there is a Neolithic element as well. So when you take all these elements, and particularly add the archaeology to the natural landscape, as it were, and posit the routeway, which is preserved in the laneways, one comes to the crux: is this coincidence or is it convergence? The ford appears to be literally a nexus, a place where things are, in a sense, intersect. Natural and human and cultural activity intersect, and therefore it is a most fascinating location. Now, it's not the only ford that is just above tidal waters, because if we go to one of the most famous fording points in Ireland, that at Oldbridge on the Battle of the Boyne, we find another place, a place where a ford intersects, as it were, with tidal waters. The Archaeological Survey of Ireland have done some work on this in plotting the research of people working on the Boyne landscape projects over the last 20 years, and plotted a total of 5 fords on this particular stretch of the River Boyne. The most left hand of that is probably the place where most of the action took place in the Battle of the Boyne, but the right hand ford was key in the unrolling of the battle, because it was the place where King William crossed with his cavalry, I think around midday. What's important here is that the Ordnance Survey maps give us indications that the tidal limit is well above these fords. But if you go to the Down Survey Barony map, you get 2 interesting little lines running north and south from the river at this point, with a little annotation which tells us that thus far it ebbs and flows. And this coincides with the ford at Oldbridge, which is quite fascinating. Now, it becomes even more interesting when you consider that this is a mixing point for cold water. To go to one of the medieval texts, Catre of Congal Clarinach, and disregard most of the text and focus in on the word fiachra, which is right in dead center, because fiachra is a poet who is accompanying a king, and accompanying the king is composing the Dinshanachas of the country before him. What is the name of this ford in the Boyne, O fiachra, said Cruhan. Cold Ford is named once, and today it is called Deer Ford. Why are the names given to it, said Cruhan? The reason it is called Cold Ford is that it is the fresh and the salt water rushed together, and it is the colder thereby. So this ford at Oldbridge, which is often treated as an arbitrary location by historians, is a very, very ancient crossing place. And there is a beautiful visual image of what it was like, made by Thomas Wright just over 50 years after the Battle of the Boyne. This is it. It's from the preface of his Laudhiana. And the 2 gentlemen in the foreground are, in a sense, mulling over the new monument, the Boyne obelisk, which is out of view. What's interesting here is that we get the ramps going into the ford from both sides of the river. The ford itself is labelled, of course, A, and we actually see a series of guideposts in the riverbed itself, presumably to assist those who are crossing back and forth. And in this context, the village of Oldbridge takes on a new significance, because it seems, it may well have been the case, that part of the commercial viability of that village was to service those coming to and fro across the ford. We can also see at Oldbridge one other aspect of a recurrent aspect of fords is that routeways can be traced to and from them. So they're interesting places from which to start routeway research. We know that the Jacobite forces retreated towards Duleek, and the old road from Oldbridge to Dunor seems to mark that particular routeway, which again may itself be extremely old. The last ford that I'm going to look at is that on the River Brosna near Mullingar. This is a most fascinating place, despite the fact that the ford itself no longer exists. I've highlighted it there, and you can see that it's crossing a railway line, which severely damaged it, but also it was severely damaged even before the construction of the railway in the mid-19th century by the conversion of the River Brosna, here coming out of Loch Owl, which is simply just a couple of metres out of view to the left. This part of the Brosna was converted into a feeder for the Royal Canal. So all trace of the ford is effectively gone. But what does survive are the approach roads to it and a series of monuments. Most significantly, a castle and a moat at site, which are recorded by the Archaeological Survey of Ireland, which dominate the ford. They're literally within 100 metres of it. And also a series of field boundaries, aerial crop works, and a laneway running past Chuddenham House towards Slane Moor at the bottom left, which give you a clear sense of the trajectory of the approach roads to the ford. So this is a quite fascinating location, and I have visited it now on 3 or 4 occasions, most recently this past summer, and in conjunction with the owner of Cullinmore House, have walked part of these approaches. And this is the view looking southwards, in fact, southwestwards, down the old approach, which is now simply a farm laneway, past Cullinmore House, which sits and stands on the site of a castle. And the ford itself would be underneath, broadly speaking, or right beside the house, the white bungalow at the extreme right. Now, what's interesting here on the day in which I visited it was a wonderfully clear day. High on the hill on the skyline is a mound. And if we look at this mound, it is a barrow, mapped again by the Archaeological Survey, but its identification is thanks to the work of David McGuinness, whose detailed survey of barrows in Westmeath is a thing to behold and should be looked at. It's available online. And this is one of 2 barrows that exist overlooking the approaches to the ford at Cullinmore. Now, the townland immediately to the south and east of the ford, as you see it marked there and highlighted in green, is called Ballyglass. And this is referred to in the annals around 1450 as Balaghlass. It was identified as such. It was Paul Walsh, Father Paul Walsh, the great medieval historian, who was taken before his time. He identified this in his book, posthumously published in 1957. So he says this is the ford of Ballyglass. And in his speculation on it, he suggests that not only is it Ballyglass ford, but prior to that, it was called Afena. Now, Afena is a famous ford in the Táin Bó Cúailnge. It's referred to by 2 names, Irmi, the ford of the east of Meath, and then it converts to Afena because of an incident that took place there in the course of the retreat of Queen May of Westford from Louth. There has been a lot of controversy, if you can call it that, over the location of Afena, and this map summarises 3 potential locations for it. A, on the River Gain at Knightswood, B, at Afena, where Ballyglass is, which we've just been looking at, and C, in the centre of Mullingar town itself. Now, I have mapped this for a publication that will be coming out hopefully before Christmas in the History and Society series for County Westmeath. And I've tried to bring together topographic, toponomic, archaeological, and folkloric information to try to map out Slí Asal in conjunction with Afena. So I have pitched that Afena is at Ballyglass. I have plotted in the approach roads to Ballyglass, which give you a clear sense of the trajectory of those roads which the ford serviced. And then, by a fortuitous piece of information, I came across in the school's manuscript collection a reference collected in 1938 that the old road traversing northwest southeast over the hill of Lara was called Slí Asal. Now, I've gone and checked this in the field since COVID restrictions have been lifted, and I find that though it no longer appears to be remembered as Slí Asal, it is remembered as the old road to Mullingar. Now, when you put these pieces of information together with locations such as Timunda, which is Tagmon, Cordaglass, which is Comerstown, and T. Lomond, which is Port Lomond, all of which are mentioned in medieval literature as being on Slí Asal, you begin to get a picture of the the route of Schliassel in this part of the Midlands. And it's, of course, a strategic part of the route because it's going between Lough Owel and Lough Ennell. And it's very well possible that if you project the line of this portion of the road, particularly the line from the Hill of Lara, that it would bring you towards the Corley trackway that was so well highlighted by Cathy Moore. Now, to conclude, as it were, what I'm trying to pitch here for is that historic fords provide an opportunity for research on ancient routeways. So the ford is a gateway, as it were, figuratively, to the study of routeway. And I think most of us would recognise that the study of routeways in Ireland is virtually non-existent. There are only, to my knowledge, two major texts which have covered this. One, a 10-page article by Colm O'Loughlin, which is cited ad nauseum now by everybody, and was simply put together by the printer who published the Feshgrift for Owen MacNeill in 1940, and himself wrote this fabulous article with a very detailed national map of ancient routeways. But it's a preliminary statement, no more, no less than such, and he wouldn't have claimed anything else for it. And then there is Peter O'Keefe, known to many archaeologists because of his work on bridges, a retired engineer who put together two fascinating pieces of work called Principal Roads in Ireland 123 to 1608 and Principal Roads in Ireland 1608, I think, to 1800, published by the National Roads Authority, but only available effectively in photocopy. And you'll be hard put to find it in any university library, as far as I can see. This routeway research requires fresh methodologies. The methodology, the conventional methodology in archaeology for looking at routeways is, in a sense, that expounded by Cathy Moore, and it's not to put any diminishing element onto the excavation work on Tohers. But you begin work traditionally in archaeology by finding the site and then extrapolating from it. My particular take on this is that we should do the opposite. We should start with the general and work towards the specific. And I also think that we need to rethink our approaches. We've gone through probably half a generation now of new archaeology with high-tech approaches. But one of the things that has been emphasized to me is that low-tech approaches are very important. And by this, I mean local inquiry and walking. In fact, I find that the bicycle now is the greatest aid to fieldwork known to the archaeologists because it disarms everybody. When they find out you've cycled 10 miles to visit them, you're definitely going to get a cup of tea. Whereas if you arrive in your electric car, you may not get the same greeting. Now, Afena, just to finish, is the fine case in point of the difficulties that ford research brings up. The historical geographers perhaps missed the ford because of the construction of the Royal Canal. This is the ford now at Ballyglass outside Mullingar. The archaeologists mapped the castle, the moated site, the barrow, but not the ford, because the ford is not mentioned in any archaeological literature, as it were. The philologists and linguists who have the information, as it were, relating to Afena na Armi, Irvi, these are scattered in copious manuscripts where there sometimes the ford is mentioned in relation to Schliassel and other times it's not. And the main focus of their work, place names form a very, very relatively minor. And there's a big argument in the subject as to whether fords ford names and in fact place names in all these narrative literature, whether they're real or whether they're simply literary embellishments. So they're having their own argument, as it were. The medieval historians then have pitched in on occasion to tell us that Afena is near Orries, which is beside Moat in County Westmeath, that it's on the River Gain, which would be near Multifarnham, that it's underneath the main bridge in Mullingar in 1924. Edward Gwynn mentioned this in relation to editing the Dinshanicas. Paul Waldstein, who was a local man, as it were, pitches for its location on the River Brosna, but he doesn't mention the fact that there's a castle or a moated site there. because I suppose he's taking a historical view on it. And again, he was taken from us far too early in his career. Then in 2003, the Historical Dictionary of the Gaelic Place Names take it back to the River Gain at Derry, following Edmund Hogan, who of course they are editing. And there is a ford on the River Gain, but whether it's the ford of Afena is the key question. I've looked at both locations, and I would be convinced that Ballyglass is by far the best location. Lastly, there's the folklorists who, as it were, curate key data in the school's manuscript collection, but you have to take this key data and match it to the others, which brings you way outside your comfort zone, as it were, as an archaeologist. So the word intersectional comes to mind. You could also take the word nexus and put that in instead of it. Because from a research point of view, fords are intersectional places where you have to take topographic, folkloric, and toponomic and historic information and bring them together before things emerge. So an individual ford is a palimpsest of local history and lore laid over physical features. And in that sense, it reminds me of another type of archaeological site, the Holy Well, whose location again is often dictated by nature rather than by human choice. And both these sites, in a sense, the physical remains are only a small part of the very complex cultural activity that takes place at them. Thank you very much.